Hello and welcome to the Julia Hartley-Brewer Show on podcast and on YouTube. This is the show where we get to talk about what's really going on inside the news. Don't forget to share online using the hashtag JHBShow, and if you like, if you review, only if it's good, of course, and most importantly, if you subscribe both to the YouTube channel, that's Julia Hartley-Brewer YouTube channel, and subscribe to the podcast, it'll really help other people find the show and listen to the conversation. Well, with climate change almost never out of the news these days, often on the top of the agenda, particularly when Extinction Rebellion are telling us that our house is on fire, and little Swedish 16-year-olds are telling us what we should all, as adults, be doing with our time. My guest today is the perfect guest to talk about all of that. He is Matt Ridley. He's a Conservative peer and he's been writing about science and climate change for 3 whole decades. He writes a weekly column on science for The Times. He used to be science editor of The Economist, and he's also the author of several books on the issues of science that have sold a total of 1 million copies, including The Rational Optimist, How Prosperity Evolves. I'm delighted to welcome Lord Matt Ridley. Good morning to you.
Good morning, Julia. Great to be here.
Absolutely a pleasure to talk to you on my podcast. I've spoken to you on my talk radio show, and I'm always so frustrated at how little time we have to talk about all the big issues, because the issue of climate change is very much more than a 5-minute conversation. Goodness me, it's worthy of a lot more than that. So hopefully we're going to get to a lot more of the issues. I suppose the first question should be, is whether we're tackling all the claims that we've been hearing from climate change activists in recent days, weeks and months, whether it's Greta Thunberg or Extinction Rebellion or the Green Party or anyone else. How worried should we be about climate change? We're constantly told the house is on fire, 12 years now, 11 years to save the planet. We're facing imminent human collapse of civilization, catastrophe and the like. How worried should we be?
Well, I think we've been in a competitive auction of exaggerated alarm over the last few months particularly. It's ramped up extraordinarily this year since Greta Thunberg and Extinction Rebellion got going. And we've got to the point of absurdity. We are now making claims about climate change that are simply not backed up by the science. And most honest scientists, if you talk to them, will agree. And indeed, some of them are rather alarmed by what's happened, the way the rhetoric has been ramped up.
Well, a lot of them might agree, but they're a bit afraid of saying publicly.
That's the trouble, is that most scientists won't put their head above the parapet and say, steady on, this is a problem, but it's not yet a huge problem. In fact, for the moment, it's done relatively little harm. It may even have done more good than harm, climate change so far. That's an incredibly heretical thing to say, but that's actually what the evidence suggests. And indeed, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has sort of said that. We don't actually hit net harm till 1.5 or 2 degrees of warming, and that it doesn't come till 2050, 2070, 2080, something like that. They think.
And this is the
even
thing,
that
we talk about all these predictions, and they are predictions, but we're constantly told again and again, guests on my show will say this all the time, 97% of scientists agree that climate change is happening, it is man-made, and it is a catastrophe in the making, and we need to do something about it. That's not entirely true, is it?
No, it really isn't. Particularly the last bit, that it's a catastrophe. You cannot find any survey of scientists that suggests that 97% of them think it's a catastrophe. You can find surveys that show most of them think it's man-made, and by the way, that includes me. I do think that the current warming we're seeing is the result of carbon dioxide
or at least a part of it
from
is
industry,
man-made.
or at least a part of it, exactly. So I'm not a denier in that ridiculous word that is thrown at us, intended to echo Holocaust denial. But the idea that you can find any survey suggesting that 97% of people think it's an imminent catastrophe just isn't true. The consensus goes as far as saying that man-made climate change is probably happening. And then how fast it's going to happen, how fast it's happening is not, there's not a great consensus about that. There is some consensus about that. How fast it's going to happen, there's very little consensus. And indeed, that's reflected in the official UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change reports, which say that the range of impacts we can expect is anything between 1.5 and 4.5 degrees. 1.5 degrees is not a problem. It is genuinely not damaging. 4.5 degrees is a big problem. So that's a huge range. I'm in that range, and so is Greta Thunberg in that range. She thinks it's 4.5. I think it's more like 1.5.
And of course, there have been predictions that have been made for the last 20, 30 years.
Right.
And again, whether it's Al Gore or others. And none of those predictions have come true as yet, and even the predictions about how much the temperature would have risen as a result of the extra emissions in our atmosphere, we are, even what's happening and what is proven to have happened so far is it's not even just at the bottom of that range.
It's below
of
the
predictions,
range.
It's below the range. So there's something wrong with the computer models. We already know that.
Yeah, the key prediction was made, and they did use the word prediction, by the way. Some people say, it was just a forecast, but actually it was a prediction in 1990. The first Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report was that we would see 0.3 degrees of warming per decade, and that it wouldn't be less than 0.2. It would be between 0.2 and 0.5, but it would be about 0.3. In fact, it's been 0.15 per decade if you use the surface temperatures, 0.12 if you use the satellite data. So we're below the bottom of the range of warming. Now that's just the warming. What about the other impacts? Droughts, floods, storms, sea level rise, Arctic ice, etc., etc. No increase in droughts, in fact a slight decrease in drought around the world. That's been shown now emphatically.
Okay, now this isn't an opinion. This is factual, scientific data
Paper
accepted by peer-reviewed science documents.
Peer-reviewed science on the frequency of droughts. It goes up and down, but the general trend is very slightly downwards. And by the way, that's compatible with a warming world, because in a warming world the oceans get warmer, you get more rainfall, etc., etc. Okay. Storms, tropical storms, there has been no increase in either the severity or the frequency of tropical storms, typhoons, hurricanes, and so on. Every now and then,
the perception, of course, is the 24-hour rolling news, and everyone with their own camera phone.
Exactly.
The perception is that we are going from disaster to disaster to disaster.
And the key thing, of course, is how many of these storms are killing, which is going down all the time, not up, because we're getting better at surviving them. Mm-hmm. We're getting better at communicating, at warning, at building, transport, all these kind of things. So this terrible typhoon that hit Japan killed people, but it didn't kill nearly as many people as it would have killed 200 years ago.
And what's crucial, of course, I mean, it killed a few dozen people, absolutely devastating each one of those lives. However, if that had happened in a country that wasn't a first world functioning country like Japan, a non-industrialized nation, we've seen this, we've seen it when it happens in Haiti or anywhere else.
In Haiti or Burma, you know,
the disaster level is completely different.
Yeah.
And so the crucial factor there is not the arrival of these horrific storms, it's man's ability to deal with it. And I suppose this is where it comes down to in terms of the climate debate, because as you say, and you use that phrase denier, and I've had Green Party representatives say, we're not going to come on your show. We don't want to give a platform to a denier. Now, again, I'm not entirely sure. I'm not denying there is a climate. I'm not even denying there's climate change. I want to have a debate about the facts without someone shouting and just sort of shouting denier and then running away, which seems to me to be what the debate is now. There's even a debate on the BBC about whether they should even, when there is so much scientific consensus, the 97%, that there should even be a role, a place at any point in any debate or discussion on climate change for someone who is in that denier role. What do you say about that? Because you are not a popular figure among the people in this field.
It's really tough taking the line I do. And by the way, I started out alarmed. When I first came across this stuff in the late 80s, I thought, help, we may face a real problem here. And I've gradually become more sceptical over the years, particularly when it emerged that there was some real thumbs on the scale in terms of the data that was being presented. This thing called the hockey stick that was presented.
Explain what this is.
The hockey stick was a graph which showed that temperature had been very stable for hundreds of years until the last few decades when it had shot up. Now, and
you can find that anywhere on the internet. If you look at last 100 years,
but it has been
warming,
pretty comprehensively debunked. The modern versions of it look very different.
How has it been
the reason for that, well, because it turned out that it was relying very heavily on tree ring data, which don't necessarily just reflect temperature, by the way. For example, trees go faster if there's more carbon dioxide in the air, so you'd expect it to pick up at the end. But also, what they'd done is they'd fed in lots of different data, and any data set that didn't show a kick up at the end had been downgraded by the statistical filter they'd used. So it was exaggerating the effect of any thing that showed a kick up at the end.
So this is, I suppose, the equivalent of a pharmaceutical company saying that 100% of the people who took this medicine didn't have any side effects. If you filter out all the people who have side effects and drop them from the trial, you'll have a 100% good record. And that's basically what they did.
That's quite a good analogy. I mean, the guy who debunked it was a guy called Steve McIntyre in Canada, has sort of made a career out of debunking fake graphs shown to the stock market. And when he first saw this graph, he said, I want to see the data behind it. And he tried to get the data. They wouldn't give it to him. Then when he got it, he found that they'd done this statistical trick, etc. So that was a scandal.
Yeah.
And that was followed quickly by the scandal of the ClimateGate emails when it was shown that there was all sorts of stuff going on behind the scenes in trying to prevent people getting into the literature, trying to do things to
fiddle the figures
a bit.
But that's
and as a result of that scandal,
that scandal would completely change the way there was a discussion.
Right. But what happened was that the activists regrouped and said, right, instead of trying to argue the facts with these guys, let's try and ban them from the airwaves. Let's try and keep them out of the media. Let's bully the BBC and others into not having them on. So a lot of these big environmental pressure groups actually, went to the BBC and put pressure on them to say, you must not have these people on because they are deniers. Now, some of them are. There are some nutters out there who think that nothing's happening or that it's all...
Well, I mean Donald Trump.
Exactly, or that it's a Chinese hoax or something like that. But there are lots of people out there who I would call lukewarmers. I call myself a lukewarmer, who think warming is happening, it's real, it's man-made, but it's not as big a problem as people make out, and it's a much slower burn problem, which, by the way, the important thing there is that it gives us longer to deal with it. Because if we have to deal with it in a hurry, then it's going to be very expensive and very painful, and it's going to hurt a lot of people. Whereas if we have to deal with it gradually, we probably can deal with it.
And again, human beings will have been dealing with climate change over the centuries, not perhaps as well as we'd be able to deal with it now with the technologies we have available to us. But
a good example of that is sea level rise. So sea level has been rising for about 150 years, as far as...
And do we know why?
Yes, because it was rather cold 150 years ago. There was this thing called the Little Ice Age, which lasted till the middle of the 19th century, and we actually had a very significant warming in the first half of the 20th century, which wasn't man-made. We don't know what caused it, but for about 3 decades there was a warming about as fast as we've had in the last 3 or 4 decades. And so, yes, when the world warms, the sea expands a bit, so it rises, and ice melts on land, and that also causes a bit of a rise. So we've had about 8 to 10 inches a year. 8 to 10 inches a century. Got to get your facts right. Big difference. About 2 to 3 millimetres a year. And that's roughly what we're seeing now. We're seeing about 3 millimetres a year. So you can argue that you're beginning to see a hint of an acceleration in it, but it's very slight. Now, that is a long way off some of the, you hear people talking about a metre in this century.
The Maldives going to disappear.
The Maldives, a lot of the Maldives are building a new airport practically at sea level, by the way, so there's some sort of strange things there. And a lot of the atolls in the Pacific are, as Darwin proved, they're sort of dynamic. They build up. They're caused by the waves. So as the sea level rises, so the island rises. So actually they don't, they're not losing land. So yeah, some places are sinking. An island can sink, or a coast can sink, and that causes, the sea to flood in. The east coast of England, this happens.
But that's not to do with climate change causing oceans to warm as a result of carbon emissions.
Well, it's actually very difficult to measure how much the ocean is moving because around every coast, the coast is either rising or falling, depending on where you are. But anyway, the point is, given that we coped with a foot of sea level rise in the 20th century, we should be able to cope with a foot of sea level rise in the 21st century.
Well, this ties in, again, not just about the science and the sort of the shouting of denier at anybody who just says, hold on a minute, can I just double check that?
Yeah.
Because this also ties into sort of the notion of what science is. And climate change science, we're constantly told, this is climate change science, don't you believe in the science? I was always taught, and I'm not a scientist, I don't pretend to be, but I was always taught that you don't have to believe in science. That's the bleeding point of science.
Absolutely.
It is provable. You do a scientific experiment. It doesn't matter whether someone believes it or not. Someone else can go along and prove the same thing or disprove it, and then you move on. And the whole thrust of science over the last couple of centuries has been about proving, disproving, and moving towards some semblance of a fact. Evolutionary theory being getting to the point where we can now establish some theories as fact or as close to stuff that we can know for sure as possible. Climate science is very different from that, isn't it? As you mentioned, the idea that stopping people getting hold of the raw data, it's not science. If other people can't repeat your experiment, it's not science.
Right. Now, people often say to me, look, the Royal Society says it's true, why don't you take their word for it? Well, the motto of the Royal Society is don't take people's word for it. And nullius in verba, actually, which I think roughly translates as that. And if I wanted arguments from authority, I would join the Catholic Church. The whole point about science is you don't go by arguments from authority. Richard Feynman put it very beautifully. The great Nobel Prize-winning physicist. He said, "Science is the belief in the ignorance of experts," which is a pretty horrifying thing to say.
When you were telling us the world was flat at one point.
But the point I think about science is that scientists are like every other human being in that they get an idea and they want to prove it right, and they don't really try and prove it wrong. They'll say they do, but on the whole they don't. We're all a bit like this. We're like a lawyer in court. We're trying to convict.
But also, you often, I have found this in politics, you want to listen to the people who you already agree with.
Right. Exactly. This is called confirmation bias, and it's a huge issue in humans, and scientists are prone to it too. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's fine. We're all like that. What keeps science honest is the fact that Professor A says, "I really believe in this hypothesis, and I've produced lots of evidence for it," and Professor B comes along from University X and says, "Hang on a minute, you haven't thought about this piece of evidence, which actually shoots down your hypothesis." And they have an argument, and the result is we work out who's right and who's wrong. So what keeps science honest is the fact that you do get an A team and a B team, a red team and a blue team, as it were, disagreeing. And the whole process of setting up an intergovernmental panel on climate change and saying this is the consensus and anyone who doesn't agree with it is a denier has short-circuited that process, has destroyed that process, has made it into something which is not scientific, it's dogma.
And it's not just the fact that these IPCC reports don't actually back up a lot of what things people like Greta Thunberg and Extinction Rebellion and others are saying, or even the Green Party. Indeed, the Labour Party and the Liberal Democrats are saying, and a lot of what the Conservatives are saying right now. It's often the science behind it. It's not just one report. There are thousands of pages of documents to back up this. But of course, those are negotiated. A lot of those documents. Those are political statements, often agreed by politicians with no science background whatsoever, aren't they?
Correct. And the shocking thing about the IPCC reports is that they publish something called a summary for policymakers before they publish the report. So they tell you what the conclusions are, but they don't let you look at the reasons. And that document, the actual report, is pretty good when you look at it. It's definitely got bias in it, and it's got all sorts of activists get themselves onto the author panels by getting themselves academic jobs and calling themselves scientists. So there's a bit of a problem there, but it's the summary for policymakers that's really shocking. And then Greta Thunberg and co. and Extinction Rebellion say, well, that's all very well, but it's not scary enough. So they double or quadruple the figures and sell it. And then I'm confronted by, friends who come to me and say, well, hang on, Extinction Rebellion says we're all gone in 11 years. What do you say to that then? And I'm supposed to go, well, hang on.
Well, there's nothing in any of the scientific documentation that suggests this. What does the IPCC say about this 2030 deadline? Because the government has signed up and Parliament signed up to this idea this is a climate catastrophe, and 2050 is their deadline for getting to net zero carbon emissions. So the Labour Party were talking about 2030. The Extinction Rebellion people are talking about 2025. We'll go into what any of those would actually require, but this has all come about because of this IPCC statement apparently saying, we've only got until 2030 to do something about this. Mm-hmm. That's not quite what they had to say, is it? And what do they mean by do something about it?
Well, following their last comprehensive report on the state of the science, they then did a report called "How Do We Get to a 1.5 Degree?"
The idea that this is the bad scenario.
We used to agree that 2 degrees was where dangerous warming kicked in. So everyone said we've got to keep below 2 degrees, and then they said, well, actually that doesn't sound scary enough because it's a long way off. It's not till it could be as late as 2100 before we get to 2 degrees of warming. So they simply ramped up the target to 1.5 degrees and said, how on earth, we've got to do that. And to get to that, we've got to have commitments to decarbonise by all the countries on the planet that allow us to get there. But the problem is that the pledges we got at the Paris Climate Summit in 2015 are not enough to get us there, and they're all
not that anyone's sticking to the pledges anyway.
Exactly. The whole point of Paris was that at last we were going to get mandatory pledges. In the run-up to it, it was all about how these were going to be legally binding, and then they abandoned that at the last minute and said, "Look, triumph! We've got everyone to agree," which was pretty silly. But how do you, in order to tell whether you're going to get 1.5 degrees of warming out of the amount of carbon dioxide you give, you've got to have an equation as to how much warming you get from a given emission. Yeah. Okay, that's called climate sensitivity, And there are big arguments in the scientific literature about that. And our estimates of climate sensitivity have been coming down, not going up. So we now think that a given amount of carbon dioxide produces not very much warming. A doubling of carbon dioxide produces about 1.2 degrees of warming itself. We know that. That's scientifically proved. You can do that in the lab. The question is, how much extra do you get from sort of feedback amplifications? And the answer is, we used to think quite a lot. We now know, because of clouds and things, that actually it's not very much. The feedback amplification is very small.
This 1.5, it then becomes 1.5 degree warming. It then becomes runaway. There's this idea that at that point, if we haven't acted, it's, I mean, again, if you listen to Extinction Rebellion and Greta Thunberg, you think basically we're all going to be dying of drought, and well, I think we're either on fire, living in a desert, or we're underwater. No one can quite work out which of these scenarios in any given place. Perhaps all at the same time. Who knows in this world? But the idea is that somehow something is happening in 2030 if we've reached this 1.5 degree warming, that suddenly the world is in catastrophe, and it is going to be impossible to stop it. What is it that happens when we hit 1.5 degrees that A, anyone will notice, and B, is going to be bad? And what will happen even if we hit 4 degrees warming? What is this runaway greenhouse effect? For those of us that say who aren't scientists, but hear all the time of this doom mongering, is it bad automatically? Are there good and bad things? Does the human race cease to survive?
Well, I think two key points. One is we've been here before in the current interglacial period, that is to say, since the last ice age, we've had a much warmer spell than we're having now.
This is what the medieval
period. Medieval was quite warm, was about as warm as now probably, but if you go back 6,000 years, which may sound like a long time, but we were, that's after the invention of farming. I mean, that's sort of, it's the Neolithic, but human beings are around, and they're living in Great Britain and everywhere else. And summers were 2 to 3 degrees warmer in the UK then. There was no Arctic ice left at the end of summer most summers. We know that because of if you look at the wave action on the beaches, etc., and lots of other evidence, you can see that actually the Arctic ice used to disappear altogether in August and September, which it may do again later in this century. So the world got to that, and it didn't run away into some fireball catastrophe. Okay. And by the way, we know that man-made warming, carbon dioxide-induced warming of the kind we're experiencing, tends to happen at night in winter and in the north. So it's raising the minimum temperature, not raising the maximum temperature, which makes us more comfortable.
It's having industrialisation, it's cities, it's the pumping out of fossil fuels.
No, it's not that. It's just that because carbon dioxide sort of prevents the heat escaping, it stops the world cooling down at night as much, if you see what I mean. It doesn't make it get hotter in the day, it stops it cooling down at night. And there's an Arctic amplification effect, which the corollary of which is that there's much less warming in the tropics, which of course never gets mentioned. On the whole, winters are going to get less severe in the north, but summers are not going to get much worse in the south. If you look at the data.
I think a lot of people
will go, that bad.
Yay. But also, given that human beings have survived in much colder temperatures and survived in much warmer temperatures, and people live, in very cold, the Siberian plains, and they also survive in the tropics. A lot of people, and I'm not making this as a glib point, but a lot of people say, well, hold on a minute, human beings survive anyway. But it's not about how human beings live individually. The idea of the threat of climate change is the idea what it does to our planet, our atmosphere, and eventually making it unlivable. Mm-hmm. Will the planet, eventually, yes, when we get swallowed up by the sun in billions of years, of course it'll become unlivable, but is there any reason to think that climate change, man-made or not, accelerated or not, will make the planet unlivable?
Well, on the whole, scientists have tiptoed away from the idea of runaway global warming, because we do know that on the whole you get diminishing returns. The more carbon dioxide you put in the air, each increment has a lesser effect, actually.
Oh, well, I think most people would have the impression it'd be the other way around.
No, it's a so-called logarithmic curve. But whether the amplifications are logarithmic, we don't know. Whether the clouds suddenly disappear and you get the sunlight.
We hit a certain temperature.
But the evidence for tipping points is very poor, actually. It's true
that tipping point has moved quite a lot in recent years, hasn't it?
It's true that if you take away the Arctic ice, you've got a darker sea that absorbs more sunlight. But this is happening very late in the year at a very high latitude, and actually the effect is extremely small. Okay. If you take away the ice caps at lower latitudes, as we did at the end of the Ice Age, then you do get a very rapid feedback effect. And that's why the warming at the end of the Ice Age was very extreme. And by the way, if you want to know what a nasty world, a really nasty world to live in looks like, go back to a much colder time at the height of the last Ice Age, because not only was it very cold, and we'd be, well, where I live in Newcastle, we'd be under a mile of ice. You wouldn't be under a mile of ice here, but we'd be on the edge of it. But not only that, it would be extremely dry. It was much, much drier, so places that weren't covered with ice were deserts. And as a result, there were massive dust storms. There's an enormous spike of dust in the Antarctic ice from that date. And by the way, there was so little carbon dioxide in the air that plants really struggled to grow, which is one of the reasons that the deserts were so big. And the climate was extremely variable. It used to fluctuate wildly from year to year or decade to decade, which is why we couldn't invent farming till that period was over.
Because you couldn't have consistent methods that work.
So actually, that was we got through it. I mean, you and I were running around chasing mammoths at the time. But human beings got through it, but it wasn't much fun.
I think I was busy dying of childbirth, wasn't I? That's what people mostly did then.
Yes.
But this is the okay. So there's a lot of talk about saying, what is happening, how much man has a role to play, how bad it is. But also, the discussion has been focusing a little bit more, thankfully, and I think you're one of the people who's helping to do this in recent months, on what are the costs of taking action. And it's something I know that Nigel Lawson, the former Tory Chancellor, I've spoken to him on my talk radio show quite a few times about this. He's head of the Global Warming Policy Foundation, and looking at, and they're accused of being, financed by big oil, and they're only saying things because
they're not. They don't. They refuse money from fossil fuels.
No, exactly. But this is the thing. This idea that anyone who's saying anything must be in the pay. If big oil would like to fund me to say what I actually think anyway, I'm very happy to take a check. But this is it. There's always some sort of nefarious motive behind what people are saying.
And by the way, I have got interests in coal mining in the northeast of England. I've always declared that. If I didn't, I'd probably be even more outspoken. Because I have to.
But this is the thing. There should be, if there's going to be a debate about climate change, at the very least, even if we say, okay, it's happening, it's going to happen, it's going to get worse, there's a tipping point, it's going to be, even if we accept all of the premises that man is causing this and it's going to be a disaster, there is still a conversation to be had, not just between scientists, but economists, people who understand about agriculture, fossil fuels, miners, politicians, and crucially the public, about what we are willing to do and what we can do, and what the costs and the benefits are of taking action. And that's another crucial issue, because when we have these targets like from Extinction Rebellion for a 2025 zero net carbon emissions, the cost of that isn't a few quid extra on your petrol tank and being told you need a subsidy to get yourself an electric car. We are talking about, to all intents and purposes, returning to a pre-industrial age, aren't we?
Well, to get to zero emissions by 2025, renewables can't get us there. They only produce about 3 to 5% of our energy at the moment, if wind and solar, that is. Biofuels don't count because they produce CO2 as well. Sure, they produce more than that percentage of our electricity, but electricity is only 20% of our energy. So wind and solar can't get us there. We can't, and by the way, there isn't enough land. Even if we covered the entire country in solar panels and wind turbines, we wouldn't produce enough energy to give ourselves the standard of living we've got now. Yeah. We'd have to decarbonise all our heating. Most of our heating is by gas at the moment.
So tell you what, you can prize my gas boiler out of my cold dead hands. And they would be cold, wouldn't they, at this point?
Well, they'd be very cold. We'd have to give up flying. We'd have to give up driving. And by the way, we'd have to give up importing stuff, because, half the food on our plate, etc., comes from abroad. Half the products that we buy in the shops comes from overseas. The cotton clothing is grown somewhere else.
We're basically looking at the end of civilization as we know it right now in the Western world. That comes to an end.
And by the way,
halt.
if you and I were to sort of move out into the British countryside and try and live off the land, it wouldn't be much fun for us, but it'd be even worse for the land. It'd be quite bad for nature, because we'd kill every squirrel and deer to eat, and we'd chop down every tree to burn, etc. So it's a really unfunny situation.
But then why is it?
There's no other way of getting there.
But this is it. I mean, my view.
We could, by the way, export all. This was the point I wanted to make: is that we could export all our carbon emissions to another country.
Yes.
Say, right, we're going to have zero industry in this country, and we're not going to fly anywhere. But don't worry, we'll get all other people will make everything for us. and we'll just not worry about the fact that it comes in on their ships, as it were.
We'll just pretend it's not our fault.
And we are doing that to some extent.
But then it's like Germany saying that we won't have a nuclear industry, and then they import most of their electricity from France, which, by the way, relies entirely on a nuclear industry.
Well, they're building coal-fired plants in Germany.
This is, again, it's just incredibly dishonest, isn't it? But why, given that anyone with any knowledge whatsoever of this field can tell you exactly what you've just said in terms of the cost of delivering what, say, Extinction Rebellion want to do. And again, Labour Official Policy 2030, not far off, very similar. And indeed 2050 will be a little bit... There's going to be some hair shirts being worn to deliver by 2050.
Correct.
There's a massive, massive economic cost. A lot of these people, by the way, are the same people who think that if there was a no-deal Brexit, that suddenly that would be terrible and have hated austerity under the Tories. Well,
yes,
you ain't seen nothing yet.
There's a certain double standard
there. It's for a different cause, so it's okay this time. But even so... Anyone with half a brain knows this stuff, okay? Once you only have to do a cursory read of the documentation of what would be needed to know this stuff. And yet, Extinction Rebellion and all of these targets and the conversation is treated as if it's a perfectly reasonable debate to have, and that these people are making perfectly good demands, and that although people might not like, for instance, the 9 days, probably 2 weeks in total of protests by Extinction Rebellion on London streets and what happened in April as well, and people might be cross about tactics, there seems to be a general view within the political world, within the media world, that they're good people and they've got a good aim and it's good. And the facts don't back that up, do they?
No, the facts don't back that up in two ways. I mean, one, a lot of the blame must attach to mainstream politicians and mainstream journalists who have gone out there saying, no, we can't exaggerate.
We should listen to
it's a
these
real
people.
problem. And for years and years, they've allowed one side of the argument to be heard and not the other. And as a result, they can't now complain that we've scared the kids. But we also know that there's something quite sinister going on here. And there was a report from Policy Exchange as to the origins of Extinction Rebellion. And it is basically using the methods of a terrorist organisation. You know, that there's big money behind this, which is trying to push an anti-capitalist message, which doesn't really care about the climate. It's just trying to undermine.
In fact, one of the founders has
market.
actually written a really interesting article saying, look, it's not really about the climate. Climate is a tool they're using. This is about breaking down the capitalist system. And a lot of it, again, it's not just anti-capitalism, and it's very much a sort of an anti, I suppose, it's just sort of future. It's an anti-progress sort of idea. It's the idea that somehow everything that's happened in terms of propelling the human race forward from the Industrial Revolution onwards is somehow bad. It's something that we should be ashamed of, something we should try and fight against, as opposed to the greatest thing that's ever happened to the human race. Talk to us a little bit about what the Industrial Revolution has done in terms of the lives of people in the first world compared with the lives of people in countries where they haven't seen the advent of the Industrial Revolution. Because we're often told the Industrial Revolution is terrible, and we in the West, particularly in Britain, we're the birthplace, we should feel guilty. We have this terrible responsibility and duty of care to the rest of the world because we've done this terrible thing of inventing industrialisation.
Exactly. So if you ask people in Britain or America, has the percentage of the world population that lives in extreme poverty doubled, halved or stayed the same in the last 20 years? About 65% of people think it's doubled and about 5% think it's halved. In fact, it's halved, okay? And it's over 200 years, it's gone down even steeper than that. It's gone down from about 90% of people living in extreme poverty to about 9% of people living in extreme poverty. Globally, we're talking about an incredible change. Now, Hans Rosling, who first asked that question, realized that if he gave that question to chimpanzees in the form of writing those 3 answers on 3 bananas and throwing them into a cage and seeing which one got picked up first, chimpanzees would get the right answer 33% of the time, not 5% of the time. So we do worse than chimpanzees in answering a question about human society. Why is that? Why are we so ignorant of just how much poverty has been reduced in the world? Well, because bad news is news and good news is no news.
And you tackled this in your book, The Rational Optimist.
Yeah, I mean, I recite how scared I was of the future in the 1970s. When I was a teenager, when I was told by the grown-ups that the population explosion was unstoppable, that famine was inevitable, that a cancer epidemic caused by all the pesticides in the environment was going to shorten lifespan, that the deserts were advancing, the rainforests were retreating, the ice caps were going, the acid rain was killing the forests, the ozone layer was disappearing, my sperm counts were falling, and by the time we got to 1999, the computers couldn't cope with the change of the date, and we were going to have civil unrest on the streets because of that. I don't remember anyone telling me anything positive about the future in that time. And there was a very fated ecologist called Paul Ehrlich who said in 1971, I would give even money that England will not exist in the year 2000. Well, we got to 2000.
How's
We're
that
still
working
here,
out?
19 years
But
later.
this is Thomas Malthus.
He got a Genius Award shortly afterwards, by the way.
Of course he did. But this is the thing. I mean, Thomas Malthus did this a few hundred years ago and was saying, of course, we couldn't
I have to correct you there, Robert Malthus.
Did I say? Oh, sorry.
No, you're right. Thomas Robert Malthus, but he used Robert. So it's a common mistake. Sorry, really pedantic.
Very pedantic. He knows his statistics. He knows his facts. But this has been going on for centuries. This idea that the world's all going to come to an end and the human race is somehow a bad thing for the planet. We're sort of pests on the planet. We're a bad thing. We're an infection. We're bacteria. We're definitely something negative for the planet. And the world is this wonderful, amazing, beautiful place, and everyone's living in harmony, the Garden of Eden. And then along came human beings. And along came industrialisation and things, and we've made things wrong.
Well, it's true that we do damage. You know, yes. We did cause the extinction of the mammoth and a lot of other things. Actually, we did more extinctions with stone-tipped spears than we've done more recently. Well, not maybe more, but we did. You know, a lot of the megafaunal extinctions happened 10,000 years ago. So hunter-gatherers aren't necessarily any better than we are. And indeed, I often say, if I talk at a school, I say, why is it that lions are decreasing in numbers, wolves are increasing in numbers, and tigers are holding their own at the moment? And the answer is because lions live in poor countries, wolves live in rich countries, and tigers live in middle-income countries. So actually, far from being a problem that as you get richer you do more damage, quite the reverse. We're seeing an incredible return of wildlife into cities. I mean, I watched two foxes.
We're not just talking about zoos, are we? We're talking about
we're in the wild. I watched two foxes having a fight in my street last night at 3 a.m. They woke me up. There's an explosion of wildlife return. You know, deer and beavers and otters and all these kind of things coming back. So in rich countries, but not in poor countries, because in poor countries people go into the forest and chop it down, or they go into the forest and hunt bushmeat to live off. And
they don't have time to worry about wildlife and the environment. But
Exactly.
This is the thing. But this is all part of a very negative view, a mindset which is sort of say that the Earth is a terrible place because of human beings. We're doing terrible things, and that things are getting worse. But by every statistical measurement you could look at, where the number of people dying in wars, the number of people dying from famine, as you say, the poverty statistics,
child mortality, that's the big one.
The infant mortality, the absolute number of women dying in childbirth, how long people live. On every single metric, the world is not just a bit better, it is so immeasurably better so many more people.
We've seen more improvements in the last 50 years than any previous half century in all of human history. We are incredibly lucky to be alive.
Why then do so many people have this negative view? Why do people insist on seeing the world and human beings as in such a negative light? Because I think that's a massive part of the climate change activism. Because it does seem to me, and I described it on Question Time recently, as a quasi-religious death cult. This negativity. We're all going to hell in a handcart. Everything's awful. Why does that come from?
It has a lot of similarities to previous sort of millenarian cults about the end of the world. You know, stuff that happened around the year 1000 or in the 17th century or whatever. You know, preaching doom is popular. I mean, it works. You get to be famous. What do people get out of it? Cassandra was considered very wise, whereas Pollyanna was thought to be a fool. It just isn't sexy to be optimistic. And there's a very interesting phenomenon which I call turning point itis, which is people who argue that, yes, it's been good till now, but it's about to turn worse. And if you go back in history, you find people saying that at every single point. Yeah. There's a wonderful review by Lord Macaulay, of a gloomy book by the poet laureate Robert Southey, saying this industrial revolution's a bad idea. You know, it's going to all go
horribly wrong.
And Macaulay says, why is it that with nothing but improvement behind us, we are to expect nothing but deterioration before us? And he said that in 1830, before we'd even started improving living standards, really, for most people. So I do think that there's there's every reason to think that if we get everybody rich, including everybody in Africa and everything, we will then be able to spare enough land for lots of nature. I mean, we've reduced the amount of land we need to produce a given quantity of food, by 68% in the last 50 years. That means that if we hadn't done that, we'd have had to plough far more rainforest up, etc., just to grow enough food to feed 7 billion people. We're feeding 7 billion people from a smaller acreage than we fed 3 billion people from. And, we've stopped killing the whales.
Reforestation is a massive
increase in
first world
humpback whale
countries.
numbers, huge reforestation in parts of the world. It's not all perfect. There's things going wrong. And by the way, there are real conservation issues that I really care about. And I used to work on wildlife conservation projects in India and Pakistan in my youth. Things like invasive species, things like deforestation, things like the overexploitation of the oceans. These are real issues. But they can't get any oxygen and publicity at the moment because everyone says, climate's the only thing that matters.
And yet the argument has been that we have to, catastrophize everything. Otherwise, the Amazon's on fire and the oceans are full of plastic. Instead of just having a sensible debate about, hold on a minute, maybe it's not a good idea for us to pretend to recycle our rubbish here in the UK when actually we're just compacting it and shipping it over in container ships to India or China, and then they're just throwing it into the oceans. Maybe that isn't a system that works, and let's be honest about it. But no one has an honest conversation
Our obsession
anymore.
with recycling rather than incineration has led to this huge trade in plastic in the Far East, countries like Malaysia, where a lot of it ends up in the ocean. So I'm sorry, but that's made it worse.
And in terms of where we go from here, I've got great faith in humanity's ability to technically innovate and to come up with new forms of energy that are clean and will resolve an awful lot of these issues. Given the time, letting the market work, there will be forces that will make this happen. But there's the argument for stopping climate change, man-made climate change, and any impacts of it the answer seems to be we basically regress from where we are right now. Although I think when you start taking the iPhones out of those activists' hands, they might feel a bit differently about it. Yep. But also, and
an awful lot of them seem, by the way,
no holidays, no skiing holidays.
Tracking their social media has been hilarious.
It has been hilarious.
They all go off to Costa Rica and
don't fly
Bali.
anymore, apart from me. Yeah, exactly. but also, it's often about what people are doing in the developing world. An awful lot of it is predicated on, but we can't all have an industrial revolution. We can't all be rich, because if all the Chinese and all the Asians and all the Africans are as rich as us, then everything goes terribly wrong. I want everyone in the world to be as rich as us.
That's why there's a really nasty element to this, and that's why it's not just funny. It's really nasty, because what's happening is that for example, over the last 10 or 20 years, Western countries have said, right, we're not going to aid fund any fossil fuel projects through the World Bank or the IMF in Africa and places like that. Now, what effect is that having? It means that you're not doing gas pipelines to people's homes so they can have gas cooking. A country like Niger, which is an extremely poor country, has actually got quite a lot of it's got natural gas resources, but it hasn't got the money to exploit them. But if you just gave them all gas stoves, then they wouldn't go into the wood to cut down the trees. That's a win. They wouldn't cook over wood fires in their own homes, which is killing their kids. 3 million.
Far more than any other climate issue.
Yeah, 3 million kids a year. And they wouldn't be producing as much carbon dioxide either, because burnt wood produces more carbon dioxide than burnt gas. And yet, that policy of denying aid for fossil fuels in the developing world is agreed to by everybody.
And yet we're told really constantly that failure to tackle climate change leads people dying. I've had people on my radio show in the last 2 weeks saying, people are dying because of climate change. I mean, that's simply not true. But people are 100% dying in their millions still as a result of a failure to industrialise. We know that for a fact.
I personally think, and I think the evidence backs me up on this, that climate change policies are killing a lot more people than climate change is at the moment. The evidence is very clear on that. And by the way, there's another phenomenon which I've written about quite a lot, but nobody wants to talk about, which is called global greening, which is the amount of green vegetation on the planet is increasing steadily because of extra carbon dioxide in the air. Carbon dioxide is what plants need to absorb in order to grow. They absorb it from the air, but they lose water while they're absorbing it. So they have to be careful, to sort of balance it. Now, if there's more CO2 in the air, they lose less water, so they can grow better for a given amount of water they've got available. So in dry areas in particular, there's a huge greening phenomenon. This has now been measured using satellites, and it's over the last 30 years, it's equivalent to adding a continent twice the size of the mainland United States of extra green vegetation on the planet. And this is happening in all ecosystems. It's happening in the Amazon rainforest, it's happening
Hold on a minute, I thought the
Sahel
Amazon rainforest was burning. I thought that was on fire. Haven't we heard that?
There are fires going on, but no more than usual. Well, slightly more this year, but not as many as there were 10 years ago. A lot of that isn't actually primary forest that's being burnt. It's
sort of scrubland
round about. Yeah, and we'd like to do something about that.
But this is it. We don't hear any of the positive. I mean, we should absolutely know when things are bad. We should know those facts, and people need to talk about them. But we do need to always hear both sides. Do you think we're going to get to a point where we are going to hear both sides? Certainly, the Extinction Rebellion protests. I think one of the polls last week, I think people lost patience an awful lot over people climbing onto city airport planes and the like. Even if it's not your plane, just to be a general. We've all sat on a runway and we know what that feels like. That people are losing patience with this. And extraordinary, half of the people in this country, and that's not unusual around the world, don't actually believe that man-made global warming is a problem. Now, they might believe it's happening, they might believe there's a partial aspect, or they might believe that it's not happening at all and that man doesn't play a role, whatever on the range of views they have, and whether those views are informed or whether they're just, I just don't care, sort of shrugging ignorance. It does appear that despite all of this constant publicity, this constant message coming out from scientists, from the media, from governments across the board, that actually an awful lot of people simply don't believe this. What does that tell you?
Well, I think that's right. And if you look at elections in countries like Australia, particularly recently, where Scott Morrison ran specifically against draconian climate policies and won unexpectedly, you look at Canada, where Stephen Harper was very sceptical on this and it helped him. We don't know what will happen next Canadian election. If you look at the United States, where Hillary Clinton was running against a straightforward climate change skeptic stroke denier, who thought it was a Chinese hoax. That was surely a gift to her. Did she make anything of that? No. She never raised climate change in the campaign in 2016. Why not? Because she knows it's a loser in the Midwest. Because a huge chunk of American
surface to it, but actually
exactly. So
when voters, again, people can say, "Oh, I'm worried about this." Poll after poll, "Oh, I'm worried about it." A lot of people will say, when you start putting up people's bills, when you start saying you can't drive, your diesel car is no longer has any value whatsoever because it's illegal. You can't drive it anymore. When people are told you're going to have to pay an extra 200 quid to fly.
Diesel's a different issue. The reason we all went to diesel was because it had less CO2 emissions.
Yes.
And then it turned out it was worse for air quality, which a lot of people said at the time. And they said, no, CO2 is more important. So I'm sorry that the diesel scandal is a direct result of climate change policies.
Yeah.
Out there in the real world, outside the SW1 bubble, there's an awful lot of people. I mean, there are some people who think the whole thing's, made up, and I'm not one of them. But there's an awful lot of people who think, hang on, I think we're exaggerating the problem. I think we're about to take some really nasty measures to try and stop it.
Costing £1 trillion.
Hurt me, and I'm not prepared to pay trillions of pounds. And
well, especially as why Britain should be the leader on this, and this idea of being a world leader, and we've got this responsibility because of the Industrial Revolution, when meanwhile China and India are just building yet another coal-fired power station.
Well, I'm sorry, I have to listen to pious lectures in the House of Lords all the time from mostly Tories, saying that what we need to do all this stuff so as to send a message to China, and they are hanging on our every word. I'm sorry, that is.
They're
nonsense.
Laughing their heads off, aren't they?
We've exported jobs to them by putting up our energy prices here, so they can then send the stuff back here. And China is pledged to increase its emissions. I mean, it's building, I can't remember how many, 400 coal-fired power stations or something, some absurd number. It says, yeah, sure, we'll do solar too. We'll sell it to you for a price.
How do you think this is all going to end? I have a funny feeling that what's happened with Greta Thunberg and with Extinction Rebellion and this sort of wagging finger and the extremism, the catastrophization of everything, I know that they'll say, but we've put it on the agenda and people are talking about it, and that's what matters, and we've changed government policy. My gut feeling is that they've gone too far and they've overplayed their hand. They've said, I've got 10 aces. Well, we know you can't have 10 aces. It's not possible. And that people are just not
I'm not sure I agree,
anymore.
because I've thought that for 10 years. I've thought this bubble's going to burst, and people are going to start to be more sensible about this and say, yes, it's an issue, but look at the way we've managed to drive out the fracking industry, which was a very promising
clean
technology for producing a very low carbon fossil fuel in enormous abundance and giving us more energy reliability. I mean, the moment we're becoming extremely dependent on imports for energy, we're importing 40% of our coal from Russia at the moment. What's the point of that? We're relying on Putin for coal. We still need coal, even if we're not using it for electricity. We need it for industry. Not so much, of course, but we need some. So I have to say, I had expected by now that a degree of negotiating to a sensible level will go. But it does feel like the weaponizing of a 16-year-old is a step too far, and I'm sorry.
As a parent, I have to say,
I'm not criticising her. Don't begin to criticise her, but I think she's been used by some very unscrupulous people, and there's a big PR operation behind her with a lot of money, and telling her what to say, and scaring the poor girl. Why should she live her life in fear of the future?
That is the worst thing, isn't it? That there are young kids, and I've got a daughter who's almost a teenager, and what they're being told in their lessons and what they're hearing in the media and online, just constantly the idea that the world is becoming a terrible, terrible place, and we're all going to die, and it's all awful, when the exact opposite is the truth. Let's end on a positive message about someone watching this right now who's always been a bit, I'm not quite sure about this, I think people are exaggerating. What can they do about it? Because whenever you raise your head above the parapet on this, people just shout denier at you. They do it to me. I'm just trying to have a debate about it.
And there's a systematic attempt to shut us all down as well. Yeah.
But in terms of having a debate about the real science and what we actually do to make our country and the world a better place, we all like to do that, wouldn't we? And to tackle whatever the issues are, whether it's biodiversity, whether it's the environment, air pollution, or trying to come up with more cleaner energies. What can someone watching this or listening to this on podcast, what can they do?
Well, it's very difficult to know what ordinary people can do. I think they've just got to keep raising the question, saying, and by the way, standing up to the bullies who try and shut down debate. So if a skeptic gets invited to a university, almost immediately or almost always it gets cancelled because
someone threatens violence.
Someone threatens violence, exactly. So I'm just all for more people asking their elected politicians what they think, asking the media to put on more stuff about this. Pushing for a more open debate about all these issues. I'm not doing this because it's fun, or because I'm evil. I'm doing this because actually I think the right thing to do is to emphasise other environmental issues. I'm a passionate environmentalist. I'm a passionate naturalist. I just think that we're concentrating on the wrong issue here, and that there are other issues we should be. And I think if we go down a route where we try and get all our energy from solar and wind, we'll destroy the countryside as well. So there are other reasons for raising this. So I do think that there's things people can do just by keeping the debate alive.
Matt Ridley, you've certainly kept the debate alive. It's just been such a pleasure having this conversation with you. Really appreciate you joining me on the Julia Hartley-Brewer show. If you've enjoyed the conversation, how could you not? Then do please remember to like, remember to share, remember to subscribe to my podcast or to the YouTube channel Julia Hartley-Brewer. This has been the JHB show with me, Julia Hartley-Brewer, with my absolutely brilliant guest, Matt Ridley. Thank you for watching.